The state of American democracy, it's been such a huge topic lately.
Absolutely. A lot going on.
And it really makes you think, doesn't it, about the stability of some key institutions.
Mhm.
You start to wonder about universities, cultural organizations. Are they weathering this whole storm, or are things really starting to shift?
Well, that's exactly what we're digging into today. We've been looking at material from To Standard,
Hmm.
and it really highlights this growing pressure on universities and cultural places in the U.S.
Growing pressure, yeah.
It definitely suggests there's a real effort, maybe a concerted one, to influence them, maybe even reshape them.
Right. Reshape is a strong word. The sources talk about what looks like deliberate political intervention, not just your standard policy debates, but something aiming for a more fundamental change.
Exactly.
So, for you listening, our goal in this deep dive is basically to unpack these dynamics. What are the arguments being made? What's driving it all? And maybe most importantly, what could the consequences be? For the institutions, yes, but also for, well, American society overall.
Okay, so let's start with one perspective that seems to be um, getting louder. Some conservatives see universities as these links bacons, left-wing beacon,
Left wing beacons,
or
right?
even Quischulen von linkse gedacht, like breeding grounds for leftist ideas.
Hmm.
And this isn't exactly new.
No, definitely not. The sources point out this view, this suspicion towards academia. It's got a long history in the Republican Party, decades, really.
Yeah, you think back to William Buckley, Richard Nixon.
Hmm. There's a clear line there, almost like a built-in distrust from some parts of the political world towards, higher education, the intellectual sphere.
Precisely. And the language used around it is pretty loaded. You hear culture wars all the time.
Oh, yeah.
Identity politics, and these newer terms like diversity, equity, and inclusion were just woke or DEI.
DEI, right. They've become real flashpoints, haven't they? Sort of code words in this bigger fight.
They really have. And the sources mentioned a 2021 speech by J.D. Vance. He was running for Senate
I
then,
remember that.
and he really went after universities, specifically calling out their focus on these kinds of issues. He said it was damaging the country.
Damaging how, though?
Well, he basically claimed these places were teaching students that the United States is door and door slashed, thoroughly evil.
Wow. That's a heavy charge.
It is really powerful, really divisive stuff. And that kind of rhetoric, painting universities as somehow anti-American, it can definitely set the stage for taking stronger actions.
Which kind of brings us to Donald Trump's approach, right?
Yeah.
His rhetoric, his actions. He promised vergelding retribution during the campaign,
Retribution.
and the sources suggest his administration's view on universities fits right into that, using funding cuts or the threat of them as a major tool.
That seems to be the key lever, yeah. The sources specifically mentioned Trump saying universities had to stop anti-Semitic propaganda or they'd lose funding.
Okay, anti-Semitic propaganda. And we saw this play out with Columbia and Harvard, didn't we?
We did. Columbia, the sources say, got hit with this draconish least von Matrigelen, a really tough list of demands.
Draconian measures, okay.
Plus the threat of losing something like $400 billion in subsidies and grants, all tied to protests about the Netanyahu government and Gaza.
$400 million, that's huge. So what happened?
In the end, they ployed. They caved. They caved. But did that solve it?
Well, interestingly, no. The sources suggest that even after they agreed, the demands actually escalated.
Really? So giving in didn't stop the pressure?
Apparently not,
Yeah.
which is maybe why Harvard took a different path when they faced a similar situation, but with even more money on the line.
Right, Harvard. They were looking at potentially losing $2 billion right away.
Yeah, and possibly their whole $9 billion annual federal funding stream eventually. Huge stakes.
So what did they do?
Their first move was totally different. They refused to plea in, refused to cave. Instead, they sued the government.
Sued the government. On what grounds? Arguing it was an attack on academic freedom and freedom of speech. A pretty bold move, considering the financial risk.
Definitely bold. Now, the sources also mention this idea of anti-Semitism being used as a drogreden, a pretext.
A pretext.
They point out some inconsistency there, right? Comparing this stance to Trump's reaction after Charlottesville, for example.
Exactly. It raises the question, was the main goal really fighting anti-Semitism? Or was it more about controlling these places seen as links bacons, these left-wing beacons?
That's what the sources seem to suggest, that the real target was the institutions themselves perceived as too liberal. And this whole situation sends a message, doesn't it? Not just to Columbia and Harvard.
Oh, absolutely. A signal to other big names like the University of Pennsylvania and and likely beyond.
And we see specific examples of what triggers this pressure, right? Like
Yeah.
UPenn.
Yeah, UPenn got targeted over its policy on trans athletes, specifically having a trans woman on the women's swim team. That became a huge focal point.
A real culture war issue. And Columbia, it wasn't just the general protests, but specific complaints.
Right. There were reports from some Jewish pro-Israel students saying they felt unsafe during the anti-Netanyahu protests, alleging anti-Semitic language was used.
Which led to those congressional hearings we saw.
Exactly. People like Elise Stefanik really grilled the university presidents about anti-Semitism on campus.
Very public, very intense pressure.
And that pressure, combined with donor pressure, led to something pretty unusual for these universities.
Which was?
The forced clearing of the protest camps. That was a real shock, apparently. These places usually have a strong tradition of allowing protest.
So a big shift from past practice, driven by outside pressure.
Seems so. And look at the new rules Columbia had to accept to keep their funding. External control over their Middle East department.
Wow.
Much tougher rules on student protests, even banning protests on campus altogether, all tied to avoiding those huge federal funding cuts.
It just shows how much power that federal funding holds. And the sources make a really important point about where those cuts hurt most.
Right.
It's not just the humanities or social sciences, right? It hits things like cancer research, too. Vital stuff.
That really brings home the real-world impact, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Beyond the political arguments, it affects core university functions.
Absolutely. So to really get why this is happening now with this intensity, we need to look at the history, but maybe also personal factors.
Good point. That long history of Republican skepticism towards universities is definitely there. Decades of it.
Right.
But the sources also float the idea of personal frustrations, like maybe Trump's desire for prestigious degrees he didn't get, or J.D. Vance, who, even with academic success, talked about feeling like an outsider because of his background.
Interesting. So personal feelings might be amplifying the ideological fight, making it more intense.
It seems plausible, adding a kind of visceral edge to the attacks, perhaps, moving it beyond just policy differences.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, the sources do acknowledge something the right often points to, that universities do tend to have more left-leaning people.
It's a point often raised. The overrepresentation is a source of genuine frustration for conservatives.
And there are criticisms about diversity policies too, right? Like academics feeling they have to support them publicly.
Yes, those criticisms exist. So there are real debates happening about the direction universities are taking. Legitimate ones.
But what the sources suggest is happening is that these efforts, even if well-intentioned, get turned into Sheldwarden insults like woke or DEI.
Right. Used as catch-all terms to dismiss anything related to inclusivity or social justice, which makes having a reasonable conversation almost impossible.
Totally shuts it down. Weaponized terms, like you said.
Exactly, which loops back to Harvard versus Columbia. Columbia gave in, but it didn't stop the demands.
Right.
So maybe Harvard learned from that so that caving wasn't necessarily the end of it.
That's a really interesting take. Plus, Harvard has that incredible prestige, doesn't it? It's older than the country.
True. Massive contributions across so many fields.
Yeah.
That gives them a certain standing, maybe more leeway than others.
And they're incredibly wealthy. $64 billion endowment.
They are. But, and this is key, the sources clarify, most of that money is tied up, restricted by donors for specific things.
Ah, okay. So they can't just dip into the endowment to cover lost federal funds.
Not easily, no. And that federal funding, while maybe not essential for basic teaching at Harvard, is absolutely vital for the high-level scientific research they do.
That's the crucial part. The billions for research. That's where the leverage really lies.
It seems so. The sources mention Wesleyan University as a contrast.
Right.
Smaller place, more focused on teaching. Their president felt they could push back more easily because they weren't as reliant on that big federal research money. Different model, different pressures.
Makes sense. And Columbia's president basically said that they caved to avoid crippling the university, right?
Yeah, suggesting it was almost an existential choice. Protect core functions versus standing on principle. A terrible position to be in.
Incredibly tough. But maybe Harvard's resistance, their mode, their courage, could inspire others.
It might. The sources mention over 150 other university presidents signed a letter supporting Harvard after they filed the lawsuit. That suggests a wider concern, maybe a strengthening resolve.
So there's this tension bubbling up inside universities, too, between being like society's intellectual conscience and just keeping the research grants flowing.
Definitely seems like a major internal conflict playing out. But okay, it's not just universities under the microscope, is it?
No, the sources broaden it out. Cultural institutions, too, starting with the Kennedy Center.
Ah, yes, the Kennedy Center. That was the big one.
The sources suggest Trump wasn't really engaged with it before, maybe felt out of place in those DC elite circles, didn't care for the refined stuff.
The personal angle again. But now, politically.
Now it's described as a takeover of the board, banning some shows considered woke.
Right. And suggesting performers more aligned with Trump, like Sylvester Stallone or Lee Greenwood.
Wow. So really trying to reshape the cultural output directly.
It looks like it. The goal seems to be twofold. Align the cultural elite with Trump's tastes, and maybe Beetlejuice get back at his DC opponents.
Get back at them. And controlling culture, controlling the narrative, that has huge power, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Shaping how society sees itself.
Absolutely fundamental. And then there's the Smithsonian, another huge cultural pillar.
What's the pressure there?
The demand is to de-ideologize the museums. Sounds okay, maybe. But the sources say it means presenting a purely positive verhaal, a positive story of American history.
Only the positive story. What does that mean in practice?
Well, the example given is the Underground Railroad. The push would be to downplay the suffering of enslaved people and instead emphasize cooperation between black and white people.
That's rewriting history.
The source makes a pretty stark comparison. It likens it to Vladimir Putin's approach to history in Russia.
Ooh, that's a serious parallel. It sounds almost Orwellian, you know? 1984. Who controls the past controls the future.
Exactly that idea. And it fits with this broader trend of conservatives building their own universities, their own online cultural spaces, trying to create an alternative narrative ecosystem.
And it reaches down into schools too, right? Pressure not to teach too much about slavery or diversity.
hmm It suggests a really wide effort to control the story of America at multiple levels.
Which brings us to this idea of the cathedral. What's that about?
It's a term used by Curtis E. Harvin, mentioned in the sources. The cathedral is basically universities, the education system, and the media, seen as the home of the democratic American elite.
Okay, the elite's domain.
And the view is this cathedral needs to be, well, taken apart, or at least fundamentally changed.
And if the media is part of the cathedral?
Then the media is fair game. Look at the Washington Post.
Right. What happened there? Big changes under Jeff Bezos.
Very rapid changes, according to the sources. Remember their tagline after Trump won in 2016? Democracy dies in darkness?
Yeah, I remember. A clear stance.
Contrast that with now. The sources speculate Bezos might need government contracts, which could be influencing things.
How so? What kind of changes are reported?
Things like killing a supportive op-ed by Kamala Harris, more editorial control over what gets covered and how it's framed.
That's worrying for press freedom. Could it spread?
It raises that possibility, yeah. A potential chilling effect on other outlets. And it's not just news media.
Entertainment, too.
The sources mention Disney feeling pressure, leading to some self-censorship. Though the New York Times is held up as a possible counterexample, maybe because of its family ownership focused on media freedom.
Okay, so the deep dive points to one final, maybe symbolic battleground.
A potential Lakmus Prof, a litmus test. That's the possible move against public broadcasting, PBS and NPR.
Defunding PBS and NPR, even though U.S. public broadcasting isn't as massive as in some countries.
Right. But it's still seen by critics as this last bastion of non-commercial educational media. So a natural target for Trump and others who want to reshape the media landscape.
Interesting, though the sources mention one unlikely defender.
Huh, yeah. Sesame Street. Apparently, its cultural impact runs so deep it poses a surprising obstacle. Shows how embedded some cultural things are.
So, wrapping this all up then, we've looked at this real push and pull, haven't we? This backlash against what some see as left-wing dominance in universities and culture.
Yeah, a push using funding as a major weapon with big questions raised about academic freedom, free expression, even how we understand history.
The goal for you listening was to get a better handle on these really complex, moving parts. Hopefully we've shed some light on it.
We hope so. It's a lot to take in.
It really is. And it leaves you with a final question to chew on, doesn't it? When these core institutions, the places we learn, the places that hold our culture, face this kind of direct political pressure, what does that really mean for society? What are the long-term effects on just, the free flow of ideas, the search for knowledge? It makes you think hard about what role these places play and how we all see the world.